The first time anybody saw Wendell Kirk hauling a dead beehive down the Ballard Pike, it was a Tuesday in the second week of March, and he was 9 years old. The hive was a deep box, gray with rot, one corner split open where the joints had failed. It was too big for him. He carried it against his chest with both arms wrapped around it and his chin resting on the lid, and he walked the whole 2 miles from the Merlin place back to his own with it, stopping every 100 yards or so to set it down and shake out his arms. Ada Merlin had given it to him because she did not want it. Her bees had died out 3 winters back, and the boxes had been sitting behind her equipment shed, collecting rain ever since. And when the Kirk boy knocked on her door and asked politely, with his hat actually in his hand, whether he could have them, she said, "Take all of them, honey," and then went and stood at her kitchen window to watch him try. He came back the next day for the second one, and the day after that for the third. By the end of that month he had knocked on 19 doors in Wilkes County, North Carolina, and asked 19 people for their dead hives, and every one of them said yes, because who says no to that? And every one of them said the same thing to somebody else afterward. The Kirk boy is collecting dead bees. He was not, of course. He was collecting something else entirely, and he did not tell a single person what it was. Not his mother, not his uncle, not Ada Merlin, not anybody. 3 years later there would be an orchard standing on that ridge that people drove out from Boone to look at. And every one of those 19 neighbors would understand at once what they had handed him. If stories of patience, quiet stubbornness, and the wisdom that hides in ordinary places mean something to you, subscribe and join our farming family. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. We would love to know how far this story has traveled. Wilkes County lies up against the Blue Ridge where the land stops behaving and starts climbing. The bottoms are good. The ridges are steep and rocky and covered in scrub, and the soil on them is thin and acidic and full of clay that turns to brick in August. The Kirk place was 41 acres of exactly that, 6 acres of workable bottom along a creek, and the rest of it running uphill into ground that nobody in 4 generations had ever gotten anything out of except firewood and trouble. Wendell lived there with his mother, Fay Kirk, and his uncle Osborne, who was his father's older brother, and who had come to stay after Wendell's father was killed in a machinery accident when the boy was 6. Osborne was not a warm man, he was a fair one. He worked the bottom land in corn and kept a few head of cattle, and he did not talk about the accident, and neither did anybody else. Fay kept a garden and did the books, and worked 2 evenings a week at a diner in Wilkesboro. There was not much money. There had never been much money. Wendell was small for his age and slow to speak, and he had a habit that unnerved adults, which was that he would look at a thing for a very long time without commenting on it. He looked at the creek in flood. He looked at the wild plum thicket at the top of the pasture. He looked, one whole afternoon in August when he was 8, at a single sourwood tree covered in bees. That was the afternoon it started, though nobody knew it, least of all him. What Wendell wanted was an orchard. He had wanted one since he was 7, when Fay brought home a bushel of winesaps from a stand near Miller's Creek, and he ate 4 of them in a row, sitting on the porch steps, and asked her why they did not grow those. She told him apples take years. She told him the ridge was no good for anything. She told him it in the tired way people tell children things they have already decided are impossible. And she thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. He went to the elementary school library in Roaring River, and he asked the librarian, a woman named Corinne Batts, whether they had any books about apples. She found him 2. One was about varieties. The other was a 1961 County Extension Bulletin on Orchard Establishment that somebody had donated with a box of estate books, and that had probably not been opened since it was printed. He read it 11 times over the course of that winter. Corinne Batts eventually stopped making him check it out and simply let him keep it. That bulletin is where he found the sentence that changed everything. It was not in the section on rootstock or spacing or spraying. It was near the back, in a short paragraph almost thrown away, and it said that an apple orchard without adequate pollinator populations will set fruit at a fraction of its capacity, regardless of how well the trees themselves are managed, and that the establishment of pollinator habitat should begin, where possible, 2 to 3 years before the first tree goes in the ground. 2 to 3 years before. Wendell read that line and understood something that most grown people in that county had never once had cause to think about. The trees were not the beginning. The trees were the middle. Here is the part that Wendell got right and that a great many people with far more experience get wrong. Apple trees are almost entirely dependent on insects to move pollen. The flowers do not self-pollinate reliably, and the pollen is heavy and sticky and does not travel on wind the way corn pollen does. Every apple that ever grew on a tree grew because something with legs walked into that blossom, carrying pollen from a different tree. Honeybees do a great deal of that work. So do mason bees, bumblebees, and a long list of small native pollinators that nobody has ever bothered to name in conversation. And all of them need two things that an empty ridge does not provide. They need somewhere to nest, and they need something in bloom in the weeks when the apples are not blooming, because a pollinator that has nothing to eat in June and July and August will not be alive to work your trees the following April. That is the failure. That is why people plant orchards on bare ground and get thin, poor, partial crops for a decade and blame the soil. An empty hive box, split and weathered and useless for keeping bees, is still a cavity. It is dry, it is shaded, it is off the ground, and it is full of old comb and old wax and the smell of bees that lived there once. To a wild swarm looking for a home, or to a mason bee looking for a tunnel, it is not garbage, it is real estate. Wendell Kirk was 9 years old when he worked out that if he gathered enough of those boxes and put them on that ridge and gave the things that lived in them something to eat, he could build the pollinators first and the orchard second, and by the time the trees were old enough to bloom, the workforce would already be there waiting. He did not have money for trees. He had time, and he had a county full of people who were happy to be rid of rotten boxes. So he started with the boxes. By the end of that first spring, he had gathered 31 hive bodies of various sizes and conditions, along with a heap of frames, most of them with old comb still in them. He set them along the upper edge of the ridge in the brush line, propped on flat stones, tilted slightly forward so rain would run out instead of in. Then he planted the food. He did it with seed he did not pay for, clover from the roadside, goldenrod, which everybody in that county considered a weed, and which is one of the most important late-season nectar sources in the eastern United States, wild bergamot from a ditch on the Trap Hill Road. He dug up sourwood seedlings from the woods and set them along the fence line, and sourwood blooms in late June, exactly when nothing else does. Osborne watched him do this for 2 full seasons and said almost nothing about it. Once, in the second summer, he stopped the tractor at the bottom of the ridge and looked up at the boy on his knees in the brush setting stones under a rotten box. And he said only that the mowing on that slope was going to be a nuisance now. And then he drove on. It went badly. The first winter, a bear came through and destroyed 9 of the boxes. Not for honey, because there was no honey. Bears do not know that in advance. He found the boxes torn open and scattered down 40 yards of slope, and he carried the pieces back up and rebuilt what he could with nails pulled from the ones that were finished. The second year, he learned that a hive box left flat on wet ground rots from the bottom in a single season. He lost 6 that way before he understood what he was looking at, and he spent a week hauling flat creek stone up that ridge on a sled made from a truck hood. And in the third spring, the one that should have been the good one, a late frost in the second week of April killed the clover bloom and most of the wild plum, and the swarms that had moved into 4 of his boxes the previous year starved out. He found the dead clusters in the frames. He sat on the ground next to them for a long time. Ada Merlin, who was 74 and who had kept bees herself for 30 years before the winter that took them, drove out to see what he was doing that summer because she could not stand not knowing. She walked the ridge with him. She looked at the boxes. She looked at the goldenrod. She stopped at the sourwood and put her hand on one of the little trees. Then she asked him what the orchard was going to be. It was the first time in 3 years that anybody had asked the right question, and Wendell answered it, because it turned out he had been waiting for somebody to. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a while. Then she told him he was wrong about one thing, and the thing was this. He had put all his boxes in one line along the top of the ridge, and bees, she told him, do not want a neighborhood. They want a territory. Spread them. Put them in 3s and 4s with distance between the groups, and put some low to the ground for the ones that do not fly high, and drill holes in the ends of the old frames for the mason bees. Because mason bees are worth more to an apple tree in April than a honeybee is, and nobody ever thinks about them. Then she said something he wrote down that night in the back of the extension bulletin. "You are not keeping bees. You are keeping a place where bees decide to stay. That is a different job and it takes longer, and nobody will ever thank you for it." She sent her grandson out the following week with the 6 boxes she had been using as steps behind the shed. The trees went in when Wendell was 12. He bought them with money he had made over 3 summers hauling hay, 41 bare root trees, Winesap and Grimes Golden and Virginia Beauty, and a few Arkansas Blacks, on rootstock chosen for shallow rocky ground. Osborne helped him dig the holes. That was the first time Osborne had participated in any of it directly. And he did it without discussion, showing up one Saturday with a post-hole digger and a bar, and working until dark. The neighbors, when they heard, thought it was a very sweet thing and a very doomed one. Apples on that ridge, that ground had never grown anything. Bo Tilley, who farmed the place below, and who had been polite about the hive boxes for 3 straight years, finally said out loud at the co-op what a lot of people were thinking, which was that the boy had spent 3 years building bee condominiums on a rock pile, and was now going to spend 5 more waiting to find out it did not work. The trees came into their first real bloom in the 4th spring after planting. Wendell was 16. He went up the ridge on the morning of the 11th of April, and stood at the bottom of the rows, and he could hear it before he could see it. The whole orchard was roaring, not humming. Roaring. Every tree in every row was crawling with them. Honeybees off the wild colonies that had moved into 11 of his boxes, bumblebees working the low branches, and mason bees, thousands of them, small and dark and fast, going into the blossoms and coming out and going into the next one, working at 4 or 5 times the speed of a honeybee, and touching every part of the flower as they went. He walked the rows for 2 hours. He did not touch anything, he just walked. That October, those 41 young trees, 4 years in the ground, on a ridge nobody had ever gotten a thing out of, set a crop that broke the young limbs. He had to prop the branches on the winesaps with cut poles. He and Fay and Osborne picked for 9 days. Bo Tilley came up the ridge in the middle of that. He stood at the edge of the orchard in the middle of the afternoon with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the fruit hanging on those trees, and he did not say anything for a very long time. Then he walked over to the fence line and looked at the sourwood, which was head high now, and at the goldenrod gone to seed, and at a rotten gray hive box propped on a flat stone with bees going in and out of a crack in its corner. He looked at that box for longer than he looked at the apples. He asked Wendell how many of the boxes had bees in them. 14, Wendell told him. Bo Tilley nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when a thing he has believed his whole life has just quietly come apart in his hands. He put in his own trees the following spring. He put in the clover first, and the goldenrod, and he came and asked Wendell how far apart to set the boxes, and Wendell told him 3s and 4s with distance between them, the way Ada Merlin had told him. Ada lived long enough to see the second harvest. She ate a winesap off one of those trees sitting in a lawn chair at the bottom of the rows, and she told Wendell it was the best apple she had ever had in her life, which was almost certainly not true, and which he never forgot. Within 7 years there were 4 orchards on ridges in that end of Wilkes County that everybody had always agreed were good for nothing, and every single one of them had rotten gray boxes sitting in the brush line above it. Nobody announced any of it. It went the way useful things go on working land from one man to the next, quietly, in the season after somebody saw something he could not argue with. There is a line from Masanobu Fukuoka that fits what happened on that ridge better than anything else does. The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. Wendell Kirk was 9 years old when he understood something that most of the grown men in his county never did, which is that the thing you can see is almost never the thing that is doing the work. The apples were the last part. The apples were the part that showed. Everything that mattered had happened 3 years earlier in a brush line on a rocky slope, inside boxes that 19 people had been glad to get rid of. He is a grown man now, and the orchard is old, and the boxes are still up there, replaced as they rot, doing exactly what they have always done. What is the slowest thing you have ever built that turned out to be worth it? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe and let us know where you are watching from.